Please don't leave. They don't know who you really are. The warrants are already moving. He found what everyone else missed.
Bruce Price was 38 years old and worked as a facilities operations supervisor for Meridian Dynamics in downtown Chicago. To everyone attending his wife Autumn's promotion celebration, he looked like an ordinary blue-collar employee who had somehow married far above his station. His 12-year-old Ford F-150 inexpensive gray suit, homemade coffee, and worn leather watch only reinforced that belief. What nobody knew was that Bruce had quietly spent the last 18 months protecting the very company they were celebrating. Then Victoria Whitmore stepped forward, slapped him across the face, and the entire ballroom fell into stunned silence until the CEO slowly rose from his chair. If you're watching from somewhere in the world today, tell me your country and your local time in the comments. I always enjoy seeing where these stories reach. And if you enjoy character-driven stories where patience, truth, and quiet strength ultimately prevail, consider subscribing. There's another unforgettable story waiting for you tomorrow. Bruce Price had never planned to marry into one of Chicago's most recognizable business families. He certainly had never planned to become the man they quietly tolerated rather than openly welcomed. 5 years before the promotion party, Bruce first met Autumn Whitmore inside the lobby cafe of Meridian Dynamics headquarters on West Monroe Street. She had been carrying 2 binders, a laptop bag, and a paper cup of coffee that slipped from her hands the moment the revolving door caught her shoulder. Bruce had been walking toward the loading dock after inspecting a malfunctioning elevator. He caught the binders before they hit the marble floor. The coffee still spilled across his work boots. Autumn apologized 3 times before Bruce smiled and said, "They're just boots." It was the first thing she noticed about him. Nothing seemed capable of rattling him. At the time, Autumn was a senior procurement manager trying to establish herself inside one of the Midwest's fastest-growing industrial technology companies. Every project mattered. Every presentation mattered. Every impression mattered. Bruce occupied a very different world. His office sat beside the maintenance dispatch center on the basement level, far from the executive suites overlooking the Chicago River. He managed building systems, contractor schedules, security coordination, HVAC maintenance, emergency repairs, and facility compliance. Most executives barely knew his name. Bruce preferred it that way. He believed work spoke louder than introductions. During the following months, their paths crossed often. Sometimes Autumn's conference room projector refused to work minutes before an important presentation. Bruce fixed it. Sometimes an executive floor lost power during a client visit. Bruce restored it before anyone noticed. Sometimes snow buried the employee parking garage before sunrise. Bruce arrived at 4 in the morning to make sure everyone could drive safely into work. He never expected praise. He simply solved problems. Autumn gradually realized something unusual. Whenever Bruce entered a room filled with stressed employees, voices became quieter. People trusted him. Not because he carried authority, because he carried certainty. He never exaggerated. He never promised what he couldn't deliver. If Bruce said something would be fixed by noon, it was finished before noon. That quiet reliability slowly became more attractive than confidence ever could. Their first date happened almost by accident. A thunderstorm shut down downtown traffic. The restaurant where Autumn had planned to meet a friend lost electricity. Bruce happened to be repairing an emergency generator nearby. When he finished, he noticed Autumn standing beneath the entrance canopy, watching sheets of rain fall across State Street. He offered her an umbrella. She laughed. "The umbrella barely covers one person." Bruce looked at the storm. "I guess we'll both get wet." They walked 6 blocks together. Neither complained. Months later, Autumn introduced Bruce to her parents. Victoria Whitmore had already researched him before dinner. She knew his salary. She knew his job title. She knew he lived in a modest neighborhood in Naperville before moving closer to downtown. She even knew the year of his truck. Victoria smiled politely throughout the meal. But Bruce noticed something. She never once asked him about himself. Every question centered around Autumn, her promotion, her future, her career, her potential. Bruce simply answered when spoken to. He wasn't offended. People often revealed themselves without realizing it. Charles Whitmore behaved differently, reserved, measured. A retired investment banker, Charles rarely criticized Bruce directly. Instead, he asked questions that quietly measured him. What are your long-term ambitions? Have you considered earning an MBA? Do you see yourself moving into management? Bruce answered honestly. I already manage people. Charles smiled. I meant executive management. Bruce nodded. I like solving problems more than chasing titles. Victoria exchanged a glance with Autumn. She considered the answer proof that Bruce lacked ambition. Autumn considered it honesty. Bruce considered it the truth. The relationship continued despite Victoria's obvious reservations. Over the following years, Bruce became an invisible support system behind Autumn's increasingly demanding career. When procurement deadlines stretched past midnight, Bruce packed dinners and delivered them to her office. When presentations ran late, he quietly proofread spreadsheets, despite claiming he wasn't good with corporate language. When Autumn accepted conference calls on weekends, Bruce handled groceries, laundry yard work, and home repairs without mentioning it. Their neighbors often saw Bruce replacing roof shingles, installing a new garbage disposal, repairing an aging fence, changing the brakes on his 12-year-old Ford F-150. Few people knew Bruce earned enough to buy a newer truck several times over. He simply didn't see the point. If something still worked, he kept it. Autumn occasionally suggested replacing it. Bruce always smiled. It gets me where I need to go. She eventually stopped asking. His habits never changed. He brewed coffee every morning before sunrise. He carried lunch from home. He polished his own shoes. He balanced every monthly budget inside a small notebook instead of using expensive financial software. Victoria interpreted those habits differently. To her, they reflected limitation, not discipline. Every holiday gathering carried small reminders. Bruce received hardware store gift cards, while Autumn received luxury handbags. Victoria introduced Autumn by her latest promotion. She introduced Bruce as the maintenance supervisor. At Thanksgiving, relatives discussed investments. No one asked Bruce's opinion. During Christmas dinners, conversations revolved around executive bonuses, private schools, luxury travel, and vacation homes in Scottsdale. Bruce listened quietly. He asked thoughtful questions. He never attempted to impress anyone. Olivia Whitmore, Autumn's younger sister, enjoyed making subtle jokes. "So, Bruce," she once asked while sipping wine, "how many light bulbs did you change this week?" The room chuckled. Bruce smiled politely. "Enough to keep everyone working." Olivia laughed harder. She believed he was joking. Bruce wasn't. Autumn occasionally defended him, but not always. Sometimes exhaustion won. Sometimes family pressure became easier to tolerate than confrontation. Bruce noticed every moment she remained silent. He never mentioned them. He understood difficult families. His own parents had raised him in Rockford with very little money but enormous respect for other people. His father repaired freight trains for 32 years. His mother taught second grade until retirement. Neither had ever judged someone's worth by their paycheck. Bruce still remembered something his father often repeated while repairing locomotives. "The loudest engine isn't always the strongest one." The sentence stayed with him long after his father passed away. It explained people remarkably well. Inside Meridian Dynamics, Autumn's career accelerated. Her department consistently reduced procurement costs. Vendor negotiations improved, large contracts closed successfully. The board noticed. Senior executives noticed. Eventually, Daniel Harrington noticed. The CEO personally congratulated Autumn after one quarterly meeting. Victoria proudly repeated the story for months. When rumors of another promotion began circulating, the Whitmore family celebrated before anything became official. Victoria even joked that Autumn would soon need a husband who looked the part. Bruce heard the remark. He continued grilling hamburgers in the backyard without responding. Autumn laughed awkwardly, then changed the subject. Bruce quietly flipped another burger. His silence wasn't weakness, it was choice. What Autumn couldn't see was that each small silence left a mark no apology completely erased. Weeks later, the announcement finally arrived. Autumn Whitmore Price had officially been promoted to Vice President of Strategic Procurement. The company reserved the Grand Ballroom at the Palmer House Hilton, Chicago, for an executive celebration attended by board members, senior leadership major clients, and family. Victoria immediately volunteered to help organize the evening. She ordered floral arrangements worth thousands of dollars. She hired photographers. She coordinated seating charts. She carefully selected Autumn's designer evening gown. Then she called Autumn with one final suggestion. "You should convince Bruce to buy a better suit." Autumn hesitated before answering. "I'll talk to him." Bruce overheard only those 4 words from the kitchen. He looked down at the toolbox in his hands, then quietly returned to repairing the loose cabinet hinge without saying a single word. Neither of them realized that the promotion celebration would become the night every assumption inside that ballroom would begin to collapse. The grand ballroom of the Palmer House Hilton glowed beneath crystal chandeliers that had illuminated Chicago celebrations for nearly a century. Soft piano music drifted through the room, while waiters in pressed black uniforms moved quietly between round tables dressed in white linen and fresh ivory roses. Along the far wall, 2 enormous LED screens displayed a polished presentation prepared by Meridian Dynamics Communications Department. At the center of both screens appeared a single line. "Congratulations, Autumn Price, Vice President of Strategic Procurement." Executives from every division had arrived. Board members shook hands with senior managers. Department directors exchanged business cards with suppliers. Several city officials mingled with invited guests near the entrance. Everything about the evening reflected success. Everything except the man standing near the back of the ballroom. Bruce Price adjusted the cuff of his inexpensive gray suit before accepting a glass of sparkling water from a passing server. He declined champagne. He still planned to drive home. His suit had been professionally cleaned earlier that week, but it was nearly 7 years old. The tie was navy blue. The shoes had been polished that morning inside his garage before sunrise. They looked new because Bruce took care of everything he owned. Few people noticed. Those who did simply assumed he couldn't afford better. Bruce wasn't bothered. He preferred clothing that felt familiar instead of expensive. From across the room, Autumn greeted one executive after another. She looked confident in a dark emerald evening gown Victoria had personally selected from a luxury boutique along Michigan Avenue. Tonight belonged to her. Bruce wanted nothing more than to watch her enjoy it. His phone vibrated once way inside his jacket. He glanced at the screen. A single text message from Daniel Harrington, running 5 minutes late, act normal. Bruce locked the phone immediately. His expression never changed. No one nearby paid attention. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and continued observing the room with the same calm attention he brought to every facility inspection. Years in operations had trained him to notice details most people ignored. A fire exit partially blocked by floral arrangements, an electrical cable stretched too tightly beneath the stage, a ceiling vent producing slightly weaker airflow than the others, a nervous contractor repeatedly checking his watch. Bruce noticed everything. He simply never announced it. Near the ballroom entrance, Victoria Whitmore welcomed guests as though she were hosting the event herself. In many ways, she was. She wore an elegant black designer dress paired with a diamond necklace Charles had given her on their 30th anniversary. Every smile looked practiced. Every greeting sounded rehearsed. Whenever she introduced Autumn, pride filled her voice. "My daughter earned this promotion through intelligence and determination." No one questioned that. Autumn had earned every step. But when Bruce approached beside his wife, Victoria's tone changed almost imperceptibly. "And this is Bruce." No title, no introduction, just Bruce. Several executives politely shook his hand before quickly returning their attention to Autumn. Bruce didn't seem offended. He wished Autumn congratulations again before quietly stepping aside to give her space. Victoria noticed. "So," she said softly enough that nearby guests could still hear, "you actually wore that suit." Bruce looked down briefly. It seemed appropriate. Victoria smiled. "I suppose facilities management has different standards." Bruce answered with the same calm voice. "It was clean," Victoria laughed politely. "So practical." Before Bruce could respond, another guest approached. Victoria immediately turned away. Conversation over. Across the room, Olivia Whitmore stood beside a group of young attorneys from her Chicago law firm. She spotted Bruce almost immediately. "There he is," she whispered. One attorney glanced toward Bruce. "Your brother-in-law?" Olivia nodded. "The maintenance guy." "He doesn't look like maintenance." "That's because he's trying." The small group laughed. Bruce never heard them. But the narrator observed something Bruce sensed without hearing a single word. He had lived through enough family gatherings to recognize the rhythm of quiet ridicule. He simply chose not to chase it. Near the stage, Daniel Harrington finally entered the ballroom. Although the CEO's arrival drew immediate attention, Daniel didn't head toward the center of the room. Instead, he quietly greeted board members before exchanging a brief handshake with General Counsel Michael Donovan. Neither man smiled much. Michael carried a slim leather portfolio tucked beneath one arm. Rebecca Collins, Meridian's Director of Internal Audit, joined them moments later. She held a tablet instead of a champagne glass. The three executives spoke quietly for less than 30 seconds. Then they separated, as though nothing unusual had happened. Bruce noticed. He didn't react. Daniel eventually crossed the ballroom toward Bruce. Several executives assumed the CEO wanted to congratulate Autumn's husband out of courtesy. Instead, Daniel simply extended his hand. "Good evening, Bruce." "Good evening, Daniel." The use of first names lasted less than 2 seconds. Most people barely registered it. Victoria did. She frowned almost invisibly. Daniel asked only one question. "Everything all right?" Bruce answered just as quietly. "So far." Daniel nodded once. "I'll see you shortly." Then he walked away. Victoria watched the entire exchange. Why would the CEO speak to Bruce that way? She dismissed the thought almost immediately. Daniel Harrington treated everyone politely. That had to be the explanation. Meanwhile, Autumn finally found a quiet moment beside Bruce near one of the ballroom windows overlooking Monroe Street. "You okay?" she asked. Bruce smiled gently. "Of course. My mother hasn't started yet." Bruce looked toward Victoria, greeting another executive. "I think she already has." Autumn sighed. "I'm sorry." Bruce shrugged lightly. "Tonight isn't about me." She reached for his hand. "For what it's worth, I'm glad you're here." Bruce squeezed her fingers once. "I wouldn't have missed it." Before either could continue, another vice president approached to congratulate Autumn. Bruce stepped backward automatically. He had developed the habit years ago. Whenever Autumn needed the spotlight, he willingly disappeared into the background. Not because he lacked confidence, because he understood moments belonged to different people. Daniel noticed that too. From across the ballroom, he watched Bruce quietly refill Autumn's water glass before walking away without interrupting her conversation. There was no performance, no attempt to appear supportive. It was simply who Bruce was. Michael Donovan joined Daniel again. "They're all here." Daniel nodded. "Everyone?" "Every person we expected." Daniel looked toward Bruce. "And he has no idea what's about to happen tonight." Michael hesitated. "He knows enough." "Good." Rebecca approached, carrying her tablet. "The federal team confirmed they're standing by." Daniel exhaled slowly. Let's hope we don't need them before dessert. The orchestra transitioned into softer music while guests found their assigned tables. Bruce located his seat near Autumn's family, exactly where Victoria had insisted he should sit. Not beside Autumn at the executive table, instead one table farther back with extended family. It was subtle, respectable, easy to explain, yet impossible not to understand. Bruce quietly pulled out his chair. Victoria noticed his silence and mistook it for acceptance. Charles noticed it and felt strangely uncomfortable. Autumn looked toward the seating arrangement, hesitated for a second, then continued greeting another executive who called her name. Bruce sat alone. A server placed bread on the table. He thanked her. She smiled warmly. It was one of the few genuine smiles directed toward him all evening. Across the ballroom, Daniel Harrington looked at the seating chart. His expression hardened for only a moment. Then he folded the card in half and slipped it into his jacket pocket. The master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage and tapped the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, if everyone could please take their seats, we'll begin tonight's celebration in just a few moments. The conversation slowly faded. Crystal glasses settled against white tablecloths. Hundreds of eyes turned toward the stage. Victoria smiled with satisfaction. To her, the evening was unfolding exactly as planned. She had no way of knowing that within the next hour, every carefully arranged seat, every polished speech, and every assumption she had ever made about Bruce Price would begin collapsing in front of everyone she had spent a lifetime trying to impress. The applause faded as the master of ceremonies stepped away from the microphone. A spotlight settled on Autumn Price as she walked toward the stage with a composed smile. She thanked the board of directors, her colleagues, and the mentors who had guided her career. Her voice remained steady, but every few seconds her eyes drifted toward Bruce, who sat one table behind the executive section exactly where the seating chart had placed him. Bruce smiled each time their eyes met. He wanted her to enjoy the evening. For a brief moment it seemed possible that the night would pass without another cutting remark. Then Victoria Whitmore stood. "My daughter didn't get here by accident," she announced before anyone else could speak. She earned every promotion through hard work, intelligence, and determination. Several guests applauded politely. Victoria accepted the applause with a gracious nod. And every successful woman deserves people around her who help her move forward. Bruce sensed the direction of the speech before anyone else did. He quietly placed his water glass on the table. Victoria turned slowly toward him. "Unfortunately," she continued with a thin smile, "not everyone in this room has contributed equally." The ballroom grew noticeably quieter. Autumn's smile disappeared. "Mom," she said softly. Victoria ignored her. "I've spent years watching my daughter carry the weight of this marriage." Several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Charles Whitmore shifted uneasily in his chair. Olivia folded her arms without saying a word. Bruce remained seated. Inside, he felt the familiar tightening in his chest that always came before one of Victoria's public criticisms. He wondered not for the first time why she seemed determined to measure every human being by a business card. Still, he reminded himself of something his father used to say. "Don't answer anger with another kind of anger." Victoria took another step toward Bruce. "You've had every opportunity to become something more." Silence filled the ballroom. "You've watched Autumn climb while you've stayed exactly where you started." Bruce calmly met her eyes. "I've always been proud of Autumn." "That's not what I asked." "I know." The answer frustrated Victoria even more. Guests around the nearby tables stopped eating altogether. Even the servers paused, uncertain whether to continue pouring drinks. Victoria laughed once, though there was no humor in it. "You hide behind humility," Bruce answered quietly. "I don't believe I do." "No," she gestured broadly toward the ballroom. "My daughter is one of the youngest vice presidents this company has ever promoted." More polite applause followed. "And you're still supervising maintenance crews?" Bruce nodded once. "Yes." Doesn't that embarrass you? Bruce looked down briefly before raising his eyes again. No. The answer was so calm that several executives glanced toward him in surprise. Victoria had expected defensiveness. Instead, she found composure. She interpreted it as stubbornness. You drive that old truck? Yes. You wear suits older than some of the employees here. Bruce almost smiled. They still fit. A nervous laugh rippled through part of the ballroom. Victoria immediately silenced it with a cold look. This isn't funny. Bruce didn't answer. Autumn finally stepped away from the stage. Mom, please. Victoria held up one hand. No, Autumn. Her voice became louder. You've spent years pretending everything is fine. She pointed directly at Bruce. You deserve someone who matches your success. The words landed heavily across the room. Bruce felt dozens of eyes settle on him. He resisted the urge to look around. He had learned long ago that humiliation became stronger the moment someone searched for witnesses. Instead, he focused on Autumn. She looked trapped, ashamed, conflicted. Bruce wished she would say something. Anything. Even a simple request for everyone to sit down. Seconds passed. She remained silent. Bruce felt that silence more sharply than Victoria's insults. Daniel Harrington watched the entire exchange from the executive table. His expression never changed. Michael Donovan leaned slightly toward him. Should we stop this? Daniel's answer came quietly. Not yet. Rebecca Collins looked equally uncomfortable. Several board members whispered among themselves. The evening had clearly drifted far beyond an ordinary family disagreement. Victoria stepped closer until she stood directly in front of Bruce. Tell everyone, she demanded. What exactly have you accomplished that compares with what Autumn has achieved? Bruce slowly stood, not to argue, simply because he preferred not to remain seated while someone spoke to him. He kept his hands relaxed at his sides. His voice remained almost conversational. I'm proud of my work. Victoria stared at him. That's it. It's honest work. You could have become anything. Bruce answered without hesitation. I became someone I can respect. For the first time that evening, several people at nearby tables lowered their eyes. There was nothing arrogant in Bruce's reply, only conviction. Victoria interpreted it as defiance. You've been holding my daughter back for years. Bruce gently shook his head. I've never asked Autumn to choose my path. No, Victoria snapped. You simply gave her one more person to carry. Autumn finally found her voice. Mom, stop. Victoria ignored her daughter completely. Look around this room. She swept her arm toward the executives. These are leaders. Her hand stopped in Bruce's direction. And then there's you. Bruce remained perfectly still. Inside, disappointment settled over him. Not because Victoria insulted him. She had done that for years. What hurt was realizing Autumn still hadn't stepped between them. He understood family pressure. He understood awkward moments. But some moments demanded courage. This felt like one of them. Victoria took one final step. If you truly loved Autumn, she paused deliberately, you would have walked away years ago. The sentence echoed through the silent ballroom. Bruce inhaled slowly. When he spoke, his voice barely rose above conversation. I love your daughter enough to let her decide what's best for her. Victoria's expression hardened. Then let me help. Before anyone realized what she intended, her right hand rose sharply. The crack echoed through the ballroom. Bruce's head turned slightly with the force of the slap. No one moved. A champagne flute slipped from someone's hand and shattered against the marble floor. The orchestra stopped playing mid-note. Autumn gasped. Mom! Bruce closed his eyes for one brief second. His cheek burned, but the physical pain barely registered. What lingered was the overwhelming stillness that followed. He slowly opened his eyes. Without anger, Without shouting, without raising a hand, he reached up and straightened his slightly crooked glasses. Then he looked at Victoria with the same calm expression he had worn all evening. "I hope," he said quietly, "that made you feel better." Victoria opened her mouth but found no words. Bruce turned toward Autumn. "I'm sorry your celebration became this." He picked up his suit jacket from the back of the chair. "I think it's best if I leave." He had taken only 2 steps toward the ballroom exit when a calm, authoritative voice broke the silence. "Bruce." He stopped. The entire room turned toward the speaker. Daniel Harrington had risen from his chair. The CEO looked directly at Bruce. His expression was composed but unmistakably firm. "Please don't leave." Bruce slowly turned to face him. Daniel took one deliberate step forward. "There are some things everyone in this room needs to hear before this evening is over." Daniel Harrington did not raise his voice. He didn't have to. The authority he carried filled the ballroom more effectively than any microphone ever could. Every executive remained seated. Every conversation had stopped. Even the servers stood motionless near the walls, uncertain whether they should continue working or simply disappear into the background. Bruce looked at the CEO for several long seconds. His first instinct was still to leave, not because he was angry, because he wanted to spare Autumn any further embarrassment. Daniel seemed to understand exactly what Bruce was thinking. "Please," he repeated, his tone respectful rather than commanding. "Stay." Bruce slowly nodded once. "Sorry, if that's what you want." "It is." Bruce placed his suit jacket back over the chair instead of putting it on. He remained standing. Victoria folded her arms. "Daniel, I'm terribly sorry you had to witness a private family disagreement." Daniel turned toward her. "No, Mrs. Whitmore?" His voice remained calm. "What I witnessed wasn't a family disagreement." The room became even quieter. "I witnessed a guest being publicly humiliated." Victoria forced a polite smile. Sure. I'm sure emotions simply got ahead of everyone." Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked across the ballroom. "I'd like everyone's attention." No one moved. The master of ceremonies quietly stepped away from the podium without being asked. Daniel walked toward the stage with slow, deliberate steps. Michael Donovan rose from the executive table. Rebecca Collins did the same. Bruce immediately noticed that both of them carried serious expressions. Something larger was unfolding. Something planned. Autumn looked from Bruce to Daniel, unable to understand why the CEO seemed more concerned about her husband than the incident itself. Charles leaned toward Victoria. "I think we should sit down." Victoria whispered back, "This is ridiculous." Nevertheless, she returned to her chair. Daniel reached the podium and adjusted the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began. This evening was intended to celebrate an outstanding professional achievement. He looked toward Autumn. "Vice President Price has earned every bit of recognition she has received." Autumn nodded appreciatively. Daniel continued. "Nothing I say next should diminish that accomplishment." Several guests relaxed slightly. Then Daniel's expression changed. However, the single word restored the tension immediately. "I cannot allow tonight to continue as though what just occurred never happened." His eyes settled on Bruce. "For the past several minutes, many assumptions have been made about Mr. Bruce Price." No one spoke. "I've heard comments regarding his career." Daniel paused. "His ambition." Another pause. "His contribution." Victoria shifted uncomfortably. Daniel rested both hands on the podium. "I believe those assumptions deserve correction." Olivia quietly rolled her eyes. She whispered towards one of the attorneys beside her. "I can't believe he's making a speech about maintenance." The attorney didn't answer. Something in Daniel's expression discouraged even quiet conversation. Bruce remained standing beside his chair. His heartbeat had begun to quicken. He knew Daniel was about to reveal something, exactly how much he couldn't predict. Months earlier, they had agreed that the confidential investigation would remain secret until the legal department authorized disclosure. Bruce had honored that agreement without exception. He trusted Daniel, even now. Daniel looked toward Michael Donovan. "Michael." The general counsel stood and walked calmly toward the stage, carrying the same slim leather portfolio Bruce had noticed earlier. The audience watched him with growing curiosity. Michael placed the portfolio on the podium, but didn't open it. Instead, he stood quietly beside Daniel. Victoria frowned. "What is this?" Charles whispered. "Just listen." Daniel continued. "Some of you know Mr. Donovan as our general counsel." Several people nodded. "Others know Rebecca Collins as our director of internal audit." Rebecca joined them beside the stage. 3 senior leaders now stood together. None of them smiled. Autumn suddenly felt a knot forming in her stomach. This no longer resembled an interruption. It resembled the beginning of an official announcement. Daniel looked directly at Bruce again. "I owe you an apology." The sentence struck the room like another slap. Bruce blinked. "You don't owe me anything." Daniel shook his head. "I disagree." Bruce said nothing. Daniel continued. "For 18 months, I've asked you to carry responsibilities that no one outside a very small group could ever acknowledge." Victoria frowned again. "What responsibilities?" Daniel ignored the interruption. "I also asked you to accept criticism you couldn't answer." Bruce's expression remained calm. "You told me it was necessary." "It was." Daniel's voice softened. "But that doesn't make it fair." Autumn stared at Bruce. 18 months' responsibilities. She searched her memory. There had been evenings when Bruce arrived home unusually late. Weekend calls he never explained. Occasional business meetings he dismissed as routine maintenance reviews. She had never questioned them. Now those memories began fitting together in ways that made no sense. Victoria looked toward Autumn. "What is he talking about?" Autumn quietly answered. "I don't know." Daniel slowly opened the leather portfolio. Inside rested several sealed folders marked only with colored tabs. No titles, no company logos, just carefully organized documents. Michael removed one folder but kept it closed. Daniel addressed the ballroom once more. Before anyone forms another opinion about Bruce Price," he glanced briefly toward Victoria, "I'd like everyone to understand something." His voice became firmer. "Titles do not always reveal responsibility." Bruce lowered his eyes slightly. He knew exactly where this conversation was heading now. He also knew there would be no turning back. Daniel continued. "For more than a year, Bruce has performed duties that extended far beyond facilities operations." Murmurs spread throughout the ballroom. One vice president whispered, "What does that mean?" Another answered, "I have no idea." Rebecca remained silent. Her attention stayed fixed on Daniel. Victoria laughed nervously. "Surely this is being exaggerated." Daniel looked directly at her. "I assure you it is not." She opened her mouth to respond. Daniel politely raised one hand. "Please allow me to finish." For the first time all evening, Victoria said nothing. Daniel stepped away from the podium and descended from the stage. Instead of returning to the executive table, he walked across the ballroom until he stood only a few feet from Bruce. The entire room watched. Then Daniel extended his hand, not as a greeting, as a gesture of respect. Bruce hesitated only briefly before shaking it. The CEO spoke loudly enough for every guest to hear. "Bruce," he paused. "Thank you for keeping your promise even when it required enduring moments like this," Bruce answered quietly. "I gave you my word, and you never broke it." Daniel nodded once before turning back toward the audience. Most people in this room believe they know Bruce Price. His gaze swept across the executive's board members, family members, and invited guests. They know where he parks. They know what he drives. They know his job title. He paused. But almost none of you know what he has actually been doing since 18 months ago. Michael Donovan slowly lifted the first sealed folder. The room collectively held its breath. Daniel looked once more at Bruce. I think it's finally time they do. No one in the ballroom spoke. The silence no longer belonged to embarrassment. It belonged to anticipation. Michael Donovan carefully opened the first folder and removed several documents. He handed them to Daniel, who glanced over the pages before looking back at the audience. I'm not going to discuss every detail tonight, Daniel said. An active legal matter requires discretion. He paused deliberately. But I can explain why Bruce Price deserves something very different from the treatment he received a few moments ago. Victoria folded her arms again. What legal matter? Daniel answered without irritation. One that has occupied a small investigative team inside Meridian Dynamics for the last 18 months. Rebecca Collins stepped forward. The investigation began after internal audit discovered irregularities involving vendor approvals, facility access records, and procurement authorizations. Several executives exchanged uneasy glances. Autumn felt her stomach tighten. Procurement authorizations. That was her division. Daniel immediately addressed the concern forming in her expression. Autumn, this investigation was never focused on you. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. You earned your promotion honestly. Autumn nodded slowly. Thank you, Daniel continued. The individuals responsible were careful. Very careful. They understood corporate procedures. They understood financial controls, and they believed no one would notice the small inconsistencies that accumulated over time. Michael held up a document. They underestimated someone. Every eye drifted toward Bruce. Bruce wished they wouldn't. He had never wanted public recognition. Daniel smiled slightly. 18 months ago, Bruce reported something most people would have ignored. Victoria frowned. A maintenance issue. Bruce almost laughed at the assumption, but remained silent. Daniel shook his head. It began with maintenance. Several guests looked confused. Daniel explained. Bruce noticed that a secured records room required repeated emergency access late at night. Nothing appeared stolen. Nothing appeared damaged. But access logs didn't match the contractor schedules. Rebecca continued the explanation. Initially, we believed it was a software error. Bruce quietly added his first words since Daniel had begun speaking. I thought that too. Daniel nodded. But Bruce didn't stop there. He checked every contractor request. He compared badge activity. He reviewed maintenance work orders. He noticed patterns no automated system had identified. Victoria interrupted. Surely that wasn't his responsibility. Bruce answered calmly. No. Then why involve yourself? Bruce looked at her without resentment. Because something didn't make sense. The simplicity of the answer lingered in the room. Daniel smiled. That's Bruce. He doesn't ignore problems simply because they're outside his job description. Michael opened another folder. His observations eventually led internal audit to examine several procurement approvals. Autumn instinctively looked toward Rebecca. Rebecca gave her a reassuring nod. Again, not your approvals. Autumn relaxed slightly. Daniel continued. The fraud was sophisticated. False maintenance invoices. Duplicate vendor identities. Forged approval chains. Millions of dollars distributed through transactions small enough to avoid immediate detection. Several board members looked genuinely shocked. One quietly asked, How much, Nan? Daniel answered honestly. We still don't know the final number. The ballroom erupted into whispers. Victoria looked from Daniel to Bruce. Her confident expression had begun to crack. She still refused to believe the story centered on her son-in-law. "So, Bruce discovered all this," Daniel answered carefully. "No. He discovered the first thread. And, unlike almost everyone else," Daniel looked directly at Bruce, "he refused to let go of it." Bruce shifted uncomfortably. "I just reported what I found." Rebecca smiled. "You did much more than that." Bruce remained silent. Rebecca addressed the audience. "When the investigation expanded, we needed someone who understood every building, every contractor, every access point, and every maintenance schedule." She looked toward Bruce. "There was only one person who possessed that knowledge," Michael added. "More importantly, there was only one person everyone overlooked." A quiet realization spread through the executives. Bruce had moved through every building every day. No one questioned his presence. No one wondered why a facilities supervisor entered mechanical rooms, storage areas, loading docks, maintenance offices, archives, or contractor meetings. He belonged everywhere, and because he belonged everywhere, he became nearly invisible. Daniel continued. "The people responsible never viewed Bruce as a threat. They barely noticed him." Bruce quietly said, "That made the work easier." Victoria stared at him. "You mean—" Bruce nodded once. "They talked freely around me." The ballroom fell silent again. Rebecca explained. "They assumed Bruce couldn't understand executive discussions." Michael smiled faintly. "That assumption became very expensive." Several executives laughed nervously. Victoria didn't. She remembered every dismissive comment she had ever made about Bruce's intelligence. Daniel slowly paced across the ballroom. There were evenings Bruce remained in this building until 2 in the morning. There were weekends he inspected areas no one requested. There were contractor meetings he attended without attracting attention. There were hundreds of pages of maintenance documentation he reviewed by hand. Bruce quietly interrupted. "It wasn't just me." Daniel turned toward him. "No, it wasn't," he acknowledged Rebecca. "Internal audit." Then Michael. "Legal," finally himself. "And my office." "But none of us could have started without Bruce." Applause began somewhere near the back of the ballroom. One person, then another. Within seconds, nearly half the room was applauding. Bruce immediately looked uncomfortable. He raised one hand slightly. "Please." The applause gradually faded. "I wasn't trying to become anyone's hero." Daniel smiled. "I know." Bruce looked across the room. "I was doing my job." Rebecca gently corrected him. "You were protecting everyone else's." Autumn could no longer take her eyes off her husband. Pieces of the past 18 months replayed inside her mind. The unexplained late nights, the exhausted mornings, the times Bruce quietly said he had one more inspection, the confidential phone calls he always took outside. She had accepted every explanation because she trusted him. Now she realized he had been carrying an enormous burden completely alone, not because he wanted secrets between them, because he had promised confidentiality. A tear formed in her eye. Bruce noticed. He gave her the same reassuring smile he always had, as if nothing extraordinary had happened, as if tonight could still become her celebration. Daniel returned to the podium. "I've worked with thousands of professionals during my career. I've met brilliant executives, exceptional attorneys, remarkable engineers." He looked toward Bruce. "But integrity cannot be taught. It reveals itself only when recognition is impossible." He let the sentence settle. For 18 months, Bruce Price received no promotion, no bonus, no public praise. In fact, Daniel glanced briefly toward Victoria. He accepted criticism from people who had no idea what he was sacrificing. The words struck harder than any accusation. Victoria lowered her eyes for the first time that evening. Charles slowly exhaled. Olivia shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Around the ballroom, conversations had disappeared completely. The room no longer saw Bruce as the quiet facilities supervisor sitting at the family table. They saw a man who had quietly protected the company while accepting disrespect without revealing why. And Daniel Harrington still wasn't finished. Daniel Harrington allowed the silence to settle before speaking again. He understood that facts carried more weight when people had time to absorb them. Across the ballroom, no one reached for a drink. No one checked a phone. Every pair of eyes remained fixed on the CEO. Daniel rested one hand on the podium. Some of you may be wondering why none of this was made public sooner. He answered the question himself. Because the moment information leaks during an active fraud investigation, evidence begins disappearing. Michael Donovan nodded. So do witnesses. Rebecca Collins added, and sometimes suspects. A ripple of uneasy murmurs passed through the audience. Daniel continued. We needed the people responsible to believe they were safe. He looked toward Bruce. They needed to believe no one suspected them. Bruce lowered his head slightly. For 18 months, he had carried that burden without telling friends, neighbors, or even members of Autumn's family. Daniel smiled faintly. Bruce never complained. Rebecca quietly corrected him. He complained exactly once. Several guests looked surprised. Bruce looked at Rebecca with an embarrassed smile. I hoped you'd forgotten that. She laughed softly. I haven't. Daniel became curious. What was it? Rebecca answered. He complained about the coffee in the surveillance room. For the first time all evening, genuine laughter spread through the ballroom. Even Bruce laughed. It was terrible coffee. Rebecca nodded. That was literally his only complaint. The brief laughter eased some of the tension. Then Daniel's expression became serious again. There were many nights when Bruce worked a full day managing facilities. He looked around the room. After everyone else went home, he stayed, Michael continued. He reviewed access logs, Rebecca added. He documented contractor activity. Daniel finished. He met with us after midnight. Autumn stared at Bruce in disbelief. You told me you were covering emergency maintenance. Bruce met her eyes. I wasn't allowed to tell you anything else. She nodded slowly. I know. Her voice cracked slightly. I didn't realize. Bruce offered a gentle smile. I wanted you to sleep without worrying. Those words hit Autumn harder than anything Daniel had revealed. While she had been celebrating successful negotiations and executive presentations, Bruce had quietly carried responsibilities that could have placed enormous pressure on their marriage. Yet he had chosen to protect her peace instead. Charles leaned back in his chair. His thoughts drifted through years of conversations. He remembered asking Bruce about ambition. He remembered assuming the younger man lacked drive because he rarely spoke about career advancement. Now Charles recognized something uncomfortable. Bruce had possessed ambition all along. It simply wasn't directed toward titles. It was directed toward doing the right thing. Charles lowered his eyes. For perhaps the first time since meeting Bruce, he felt ashamed of his own assumptions. Victoria remained unusually quiet. Her confidence had disappeared. She replayed countless family gatherings inside her mind. Every sarcastic comment, every dismissive introduction, every comparison between Bruce and more visibly successful men. None of those memories looked the same anymore. Daniel continued speaking. I've spent over 30 years leading companies. I've interviewed extraordinary candidates. I've promoted talented executives. But I've learned one lesson that matters more than any resume. He looked toward Bruce again. Character reveals itself when no one is watching. He paused. Or when everyone is watching. His eyes briefly settled on the red mark still visible on Bruce's cheek. The entire ballroom understood the meaning. Daniel didn't mention the slap directly. He didn't need to. Everyone had seen it. Michael stepped forward holding another document. This is Bruce's confidentiality agreement. He did not display the contents. He simply held the sealed pages in his hand. He signed this 18 months ago. No publicity. No recognition. No discussion outside the investigative team. Daniel added quietly, breaking that agreement would have immediately ended the investigation. Bruce nodded. I knew that. Autumn whispered almost to herself. So that's why. Bruce looked toward her. She remembered every occasion when she had casually asked about his late nights. Every time she had joked that he seemed busier than she was. Every answer had been vague but truthful. There's a project. I'll explain when I can. It's temporary. He had never lied. He simply couldn't tell the whole truth. Rebecca turned toward Autumn. I want you to know something. Autumn met her eyes. Bruce talked about you constantly. Autumn blinked. He did. Rebecca smiled warmly. Every single week. Bruce looked embarrassed. Rebecca, she ignored him. He worried about missing dinner. He worried about disappointing you. He worried that keeping secrets, even necessary ones, might eventually hurt your marriage. Autumn felt tears gathering again. And every time we offered to reduce his workload, Rebecca looked at Bruce. He refused. Bruce shrugged modestly. The investigation wasn't finished. Daniel nodded. Exactly. The CEO walked away from the podium until he stood directly beside Bruce once again. There was another reason Bruce became indispensable. He looked across the audience. Trust. Daniel's voice remained calm. I trusted Bruce with information that only 4 people inside this company possessed. Several executives exchanged surprised glances. Only 4, Daniel continued. I trusted him because he never once asked what recognition he would receive. Bruce answered quietly. I wasn't doing it for recognition. I know, Daniel smiled. You never even asked whether there would be one. Bruce didn't respond, because it was true. The possibility had never crossed his mind. One board member finally raised a hand. Daniel. The CEO turned toward him. Were there ever concerns for Bruce's personal safety? The question caused another wave of silence. Daniel answered honestly. Yes. Victoria's head snapped upward. What? Michael spoke before Daniel could continue. During one phase of the investigation, we believed someone inside the fraud network had begun noticing unusual activity. Autumn's face turned pale. You never told me. Bruce looked at her gently. I couldn't. Rebecca continued. We changed meeting locations. We altered schedules. We limited written communication, Daniel added. Bruce never asked to step away. Bruce gave a small shrug. If we stopped, then... He looked toward Daniel. Everything we'd already done would have been wasted. Daniel smiled proudly. That's exactly what he said. The audience absorbed the revelation in stunned silence. The quiet facilities supervisor, whom so many people had overlooked, had willingly accepted personal risk to protect a company that most assumed barely noticed him. Charles slowly stood. Every eye turned toward him. He looked at Bruce. His voice carried none of the confidence it had earlier in the evening. Bruce. He paused, searching for the right words. I owe you an apology. Bruce immediately shook his head. Charles. No. Charles raised one hand. Please let me finish. The retired banker took a slow breath. I spent years believing I understood what success looked like. He looked around the ballroom. I was wrong. He turned back toward Bruce. I measured you by income. By position. By appearances. His voice became quieter. I never bothered measuring your character. The room remained silent. Charles continued. I should have. Bruce looked genuinely uncomfortable. You don't need to apologize. I do. Charles extended his hand. This family should have treated you with far more respect than it did. Bruce looked at the offered hand for a moment before accepting it. Their handshake lasted only a few seconds. But everyone in the ballroom understood its meaning. At the Whitmore family table, one person remained seated, Victoria. She watched the handshake in complete silence, her expression caught somewhere between disbelief and regret. Daniel noticed her, but said nothing. He knew the evening's hardest conversation had not yet begun. Victoria Whitmore remained seated long after Charles released Bruce's hand. The ballroom waited. Some expected another argument. Others expected her to defend herself. Instead, she stared silently at the white tablecloth in front of her. For the first time in years, she found herself without a prepared response. Daniel Harrington did not pressure her. He simply returned to the podium. There is one more part of this story everyone deserves to understand. Michael Donovan opened another folder and removed a series of photographs. Although the audience could not see the images clearly, they recognized floor plans, maintenance corridors, loading docks, and secured archive rooms. Daniel gestured toward the documents. These represent only a small portion of the work completed during the investigation. He looked toward Bruce. None of these reports carry Bruce's name. Bruce nodded. That was intentional. Rebecca Collins addressed the room. Every report was submitted through our investigative team to avoid revealing his involvement. One executive raised a hand. So, no one knew he was helping, Rebecca answered. Only 4 people. She pointed toward herself, Daniel, Michael, and finally Bruce. No one else. The executive slowly leaned back in his chair. Incredible, Daniel continued. The investigation required patience. There were weeks when nothing happened. There were months when every lead appeared to disappear. Bruce quietly added, those were the frustrating days. Rebecca smiled. Bruce hated dead ends. I hated incomplete answers. A few guests laughed softly. Daniel looked toward Bruce. And every time we thought we'd reached the end. Bruce finished the sentence. Another inconsistency appeared. Michael held up a maintenance work order. This document looked completely ordinary. He lowered it. It wasn't. He picked up another. Neither was this one. Then another. Or this. He placed all 3 together. Individually, they meant almost nothing. Together, they revealed a pattern. Autumn watched Bruce with growing admiration. She suddenly remembered weekends when he had spread papers across the dining room table. Whenever she asked what he was doing, he simply answered, trying to understand a scheduling problem. She had assumed he meant routine facility planning. Now she realized those evenings had been part of something far larger. A quiet wave of guilt washed over her. How many times had she wished he would stop working? How many times had she believed he was focusing too much on an ordinary maintenance issue? Bruce caught her expression. As if reading her thoughts, he gave a slight shake of his head. Don't blame yourself. She understood the message immediately. Daniel continued. One quality separated Bruce from everyone else involved. He smiled. He noticed people. Several executives looked puzzled, Daniel explained. Most investigators focus on documents. Bruce focused on habits. Rebecca nodded. He noticed who arrived early, who stayed late, who avoided certain hallways, who suddenly changed routines. Michael added. He once identified a critical timeline simply because someone stopped drinking coffee on the 3rd floor. Several people laughed in disbelief. Bruce smiled modestly. The coffee machine had been moved. The room fell silent again. Bruce continued. Only one department kept using the old location. When they suddenly stopped, he shrugged. I knew something had changed. Rebecca laughed. I told him he was imagining things. Bruce looked at her. You did. And you proved me wrong. Another ripple of laughter spread through the ballroom. Daniel allowed the moment to settle. This is exactly why Bruce became invaluable. He paid attention to details everyone else dismissed. Charles looked thoughtfully at Bruce. I always believed intelligence announced itself. Bruce smiled. Sometimes it listens instead. Charles nodded slowly. I'll remember that. Across the ballroom, Olivia remained unusually quiet. She replayed years of sarcastic jokes she had made at Bruce's expense. She remembered introducing him as the maintenance guy. She remembered laughing when he arrived in his old truck. Each memory now felt increasingly uncomfortable. One of her coworkers leaned toward her. Did you know any of this? Olivia answered honestly. No? You seemed pretty confident about him earlier. She lowered her eyes. I thought I knew him. The coworker didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. Daniel turned toward the audience once more. People often ask me what makes someone a leader. He paused. They expect me to mention vision, strategy, decision-making. He smiled slightly. Those matter. But I've discovered something more important. He looked directly at Bruce. A real leader protects people even when no one will ever know. The room remained perfectly still. Daniel continued. Bruce never expected tonight? Bruce immediately nodded. That's true. I specifically asked Daniel not to say anything unless it became necessary. Several guests looked surprised. Daniel laughed softly. He argued with me. Bruce smiled. I lost. You certainly did. The CEO's expression became serious again. I overruled him. Bruce folded his arms comfortably. I noticed. More gentle laughter spread through this ballroom. The atmosphere had changed, not because people had forgotten what happened earlier, but because they were beginning to see Bruce as he truly was, not through assumptions, not through appearances, through actions. Rebecca stepped toward Autumn. I should probably tell you one more thing. Autumn looked at her. There were several occasions when Bruce had opportunities to make himself look important. Bruce sighed quietly. Rebecca, she ignored him again. He refused every single one. Autumn smiled through tears. That sounds like him? Rebecca nodded. One evening, Daniel personally thanked him after a breakthrough. Daniel remembered the moment. I offered him a special executive parking space. The room smiled. Bruce answered before Daniel could continue. I said no. One board member laughed. Why? Bruce looked genuinely puzzled. My truck was already parked closer to the maintenance entrance. The ballroom erupted into genuine laughter. Even Victoria allowed the faintest smile before it quickly disappeared. Daniel shook his head. That was Bruce. No interest in appearances. Only practicality. Michael closed the final folder. The investigation eventually reached a point where we gathered enough evidence to act. His tone became noticeably more serious. But we needed one final confirmation. Rebecca nodded. The final piece arrived only yesterday. A ripple of curiosity spread across the audience. Yesterday, Daniel looked toward Bruce. Which is why tonight was always going to become more than a celebration. Bruce slowly understood. You plan to tell them? Daniel nodded. After dinner. Bruce glanced briefly toward Victoria. I don't think either of us expected events to accelerate. No, Daniel admitted. We didn't. The CEO looked across the ballroom, his expression calm but resolute. Unfortunately, what happened tonight also revealed something beyond our investigation. He paused. It revealed how easily we judge people whose full story we never bother to learn. No one argued. No one could, because nearly everyone in the room had done exactly that. And before the evening ended, they would learn that the investigation itself was about to take an even more dramatic turn. Daniel Harrington looked toward the entrance of the ballroom. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. Bruce noticed it immediately. "They're here," Bruce said quietly. Daniel gave a slight nod. "Right on time." The guests exchanged confused glances. No one understood what Bruce meant. Rebecca Collins checked her watch. "Earlier than I expected." Michael Donovan closed the final folder and stepped away from the podium. "The legal paperwork has already been completed." The atmosphere shifted again. Until now, the evening had been about revelation. Now it felt like something far more immediate. Daniel addressed the room. "What happens next is not part of tonight's celebration." He paused. "But it is the reason this investigation had to remain confidential until this exact moment." Autumn instinctively walked closer to Bruce. Without thinking, she reached for his hand. He gently squeezed it. "I'm okay," he whispered. She nodded. "I know." It was the first time all evening they had stood side by side. Daniel continued. "For 18 months, we collected documents, financial records, security footage, access logs, electronic approvals, witness statements," Michael added calmly. "Every piece of evidence was independently verified," Rebecca continued. "No accusations were made until every fact could be supported." One member of the board asked quietly, "So, it's over?" Daniel slowly shook his head. "No. It's about to begin." The ballroom doors opened. 2 men and a woman entered dressed in dark business suits. They did not rush. They did not attract attention through force. Yet something about their quiet confidence caused every conversation to stop. Bruce recognized them immediately. Special Agent Ryan Keller walked in first. Behind him came 2 additional federal investigators carrying slim document cases. Ryan made brief eye contact with Bruce, nothing more than a small nod. Bruce returned the gesture. Victoria noticed. "Bruce knows them." Charles looked equally surprised. Daniel answered before anyone asked aloud. "Yes." Ryan Keller approached Daniel. The 2 men shook hands. Then Ryan greeted Michael, Rebecca, finally Bruce. "Good evening." Bruce smiled politely. "Good evening, Agent Keller." Autumn stared at her husband. "You know the FBI," Bruce answered softly. "We've worked together." Her eyes widened. "For how long?" "Several months." She laughed once in disbelief. "I don't even know who you are anymore." Bruce looked at her gently. "I'm still the same man." Before Autumn could answer, Ryan stepped to the microphone. "My name is Ryan Keller." He displayed his federal credentials briefly. "I'm a special agent assigned to a joint financial crimes investigation." The room became absolutely silent. Ryan continued. "I want to thank Meridian Dynamics for its cooperation." He glanced toward Daniel, and in particular, his eyes settled on Bruce. "Mr. Bruce Price." Bruce looked uncomfortable again. Ryan smiled. "I know public recognition isn't your favorite thing." A few people smiled. Bruce quietly replied, "You noticed." "I had 18 months to notice." Soft laughter briefly eased the tension. Ryan became serious once more. "Without Mr. Price's observations, this investigation would likely have taken years longer." Michael nodded in agreement. Ryan continued. "He identified inconsistencies no automated financial review detected. He preserved evidence. He documented timelines. And most importantly," Ryan paused, He never compromised the investigation. One executive asked, "Was anyone arrested?" Ryan answered honestly, "Not yet." Several people looked toward the ballroom entrance again. Ryan continued, "Coordinated enforcement actions are taking place this evening." The statement landed heavily. "This evening?" "Yes," Michael explained. "The timing was deliberate." Rebecca added, "Once today's final financial authorization cleared, the evidence became complete." Daniel looked around the ballroom. "No one involved expected tonight." Bruce quietly said, "That's why we waited." Ryan nodded. "Correct." Victoria slowly raised her hand. "Excuse me." Everyone turned toward her. Ryan acknowledged her politely. "Yes, ma'am." She looked genuinely confused. "My son-in-law." She hesitated. "Was helping a federal investigation, toi." Ryan answered without hesitation. "Yes." "For months." "Yes." "And he couldn't tell anyone." "Correct." Victoria lowered her hand slowly. Her face had lost all color. Ryan continued addressing the audience. "Confidential investigations succeed only when trustworthy people remain trustworthy." He looked toward Bruce. "Mr. Price never leaked information, never sought attention, never attempted to influence the outcome." Bruce quietly shrugged. "That would have defeated the purpose." Ryan smiled. "Exactly." Autumn suddenly remembered every family dinner where Victoria had criticized Bruce for being too quiet. The irony was overwhelming. He hadn't been quiet because he lacked ambition. He had been protecting an investigation. Charles spoke quietly. "Bruce?" Bruce looked at him. "Weren't you afraid?" Bruce considered the question. "Sometimes." The honesty surprised everyone. "But fear doesn't always mean you stop. What kept you going?" Bruce looked around the ballroom before answering. "The people who worked here." Several employees looked up. They trusted this company. They deserved better. Daniel smiled proudly. "That's the answer he always gave?" Ryan added, "He also said something else." Bruce sighed. "You don't have to." Ryan ignored him. "When I asked why he accepted all the extra work without recognition?" Ryan looked around the room. "To see trained," he said, "Rantorn, if someone steals from the company, they're stealing from every honest employee who depends on it." The ballroom fell completely silent. Several employees quietly wiped tears from their eyes. Those words carried more weight than any corporate speech. Daniel stepped beside Ryan. "Ladies and gentlemen," he paused, "I've spent years trying to build a culture based on integrity." He looked toward Bruce. "Sometimes culture isn't created by executives. It is protected by ordinary people making extraordinary choices." Thunderous applause erupted across the ballroom. This time Bruce couldn't stop it. People stood, board members, department heads, administrative assistants, engineers, managers. Even many of the servers joined the applause. Everyone rose except one person, Victoria. She remained seated, staring silently at Bruce. Not because she refused to applaud, because she couldn't reconcile the man she thought she knew with the man standing before her. Bruce looked around the room, visibly uncomfortable. After nearly a full minute, he slowly raised one hand. The applause gradually faded. He cleared his throat. "I appreciate your kindness." He glanced toward Autumn. "But tonight was supposed to celebrate my wife." He smiled warmly. "She's the one who earned a promotion." Autumn's eyes filled with tears. Even now, after everything, he was still trying to redirect every bit of attention away from himself. Daniel smiled. "I told you." He looked toward the audience. "Character?" Ryan Keller's phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen. His expression became focused. He looked at Daniel. It started. Daniel understood immediately. The final phase of the investigation was now underway. And before the night was over, everyone in that ballroom would discover exactly who had been responsible for the 18 months of fraud. Ryan Keller slipped his phone back into his jacket. He exchanged a brief look with Daniel Harrington before addressing the room once more. The coordinated operation is now underway. No one spoke. The only sound came from the quiet hum of the ballroom's air conditioning. Daniel stepped forward. I understand many of you have questions. You deserve answers. But there are certain details we cannot discuss until law enforcement completes its work. Ryan nodded. That process has already begun. Michael Donovan looked toward the board members seated near the front. I ask for your patience over the next few minutes. Several executives instinctively glanced toward their own phones. Most had begun vibrating with incoming messages. No one answered them. Rebecca Collins quietly folded her hands. We anticipated this. One vice president raised his hand. Should we be concerned? Rebecca answered honestly. If you were not involved, no. The directness of her answer settled some of the growing anxiety. Daniel continued. This investigation has never been about departments. It has never been about titles. It has always been about individuals who abused the trust placed in them. Autumn stood silently beside Bruce. She looked at him as though seeing him for the first time, not because he had changed, because her understanding of him had. She remembered every morning he had quietly packed his own lunch. Every weekend he repaired something around the house instead of replacing it. Every time he insisted that integrity mattered more than appearance. She had believed him. She simply hadn't understood how completely he lived by those words. Bruce noticed her staring. What? She smiled through damp eyes. I've underestimated you. Bruce gently shook his head. You never had to measure me. Before she could answer, another phone vibrated. Then another, and another. The murmurs around the ballroom began growing louder. One executive looked down at his screen. His face immediately lost color. My access. He looked at Daniel. My company account has been suspended. Across the room, another senior manager frowned. So has mine. Rebecca spoke calmly. Routine administrative procedure. Michael added, for certain individuals. The distinction did not go unnoticed. Some guests looked relieved. Others became visibly nervous. Victoria leaned toward Charles. What is happening? Charles answered quietly. I think they're separating people. Daniel nodded as though he had heard him. Correct. Our information technology department has begun restricting system access based on legal authorization, Ryan added. That prevents evidence from being altered. A heavy silence settled over the room. One director stood abruptly. This is outrageous. Every head turned. His name was Richard Ellis, Senior Director of Strategic Vendor Relations. Bruce recognized him immediately. Richard had always been friendly, almost too friendly. He frequently appeared in areas of the company that had little to do with his responsibilities. Bruce remembered seeing him near archive storage more than once. Richard forced a laugh. Surely this could have waited until tomorrow? Daniel looked directly at him. No. Richard spread his hands. This is a celebration. Daniel's expression remained unchanged. And justice rarely arrives on a convenient schedule. Several executives exchanged uncertain looks. Richard reached for his phone. I think I should call my attorney. Ryan answered calmly. That is your right. Richard hesitated. Something about the response seemed to unsettle him even more. Bruce quietly watched him. A memory surfaced. Late one Thursday evening, Richard leaving a restricted corridor carrying an empty document case. At the time, it had seemed insignificant. Later, it became one of dozens of small details that formed a larger pattern. Rebecca noticed Bruce watching Richard. She stepped beside him. You remembered? Bruce nodded. The archive hallway. Exactly. Autumn overheard them. You suspected him? Bruce answered carefully. I suspected several people. What made him different? Bruce looked toward Richard. He changed his routine after the access logs were updated. Autumn blinked. You noticed that... Bruce smiled faintly. I notice routines. Dan returned to the microphone. Mr. Ellis? Richard looked up. Yes. I have one question. Richard forced another smile. Of course. Daniel's voice remained perfectly calm. Why did you visit Building 4's records archive 37 times over the past 12 months when your office is located in Building 1? Richard's smile disappeared. He hesitated. I occasionally met vendors. Rebecca immediately replied. There are no vendor meeting rooms in Building 4. Richard swallowed. I must be remembering incorrectly. Michael opened another folder. Our records indicate that every one of those visits occurred after normal business hours. The ballroom became deathly quiet. Richard looked toward the exits. Ryan noticed. So did Bruce. Bruce quietly stepped half a pace to one side, not to block Richard, simply to keep him in view. Ryan smiled, almost imperceptibly. Old habits. Daniel continued. We also discovered that each visit coincided with procurement documents later found to contain unauthorized alterations. Richard shook his head vigorously. That's circumstantial. Michael calmly replied, not by itself. He removed another document. But combined with digital authentication records, another document. Video surveillance, another. Financial transfers, and another. Witness testimony. Michael closed the folder. It becomes considerably more than circumstantial. Richard's breathing quickened. Victoria looked between Daniel and Richard in complete disbelief. Olivia whispered, Is he one of them? Charles answered quietly. It appears so. Richard suddenly looked directly at Bruce. You? The word came out almost like an accusation. Bruce met his gaze. What about me? You were watching everyone. Bruce answered simply. I was doing my job. No. Richard laughed bitterly. You were spying. Bruce remained calm. I documented what I observed. Richard took a step forward. You tricked us. Bruce slowly shook his head. I never asked anyone to underestimate me. The sentence hung in the air. Daniel looked at the audience. That's the point. No deception was necessary. The guilty dismissed Bruce entirely on their own. Ryan's phone vibrated once again. He glanced at the message. Then he looked at Daniel. A slight nod. Daniel understood immediately. He turned toward Richard. The first arrest teams have completed their assignments. Richard's face turned pale. The operation is proceeding exactly as planned. Ryan took one measured step forward. Mr. Ellis. Richard froze. I need to ask you to remain where you are. Around the ballroom, no one moved. Bruce quietly exhaled. 18 months of patience had led to this moment. But deep inside, he knew Richard Ellis had never been the mastermind. He had only been one piece of a much larger conspiracy. And somewhere beyond the walls of the hotel, federal agents were already moving toward the people who believed they had gotten away with everything. Richard Ellis stood perfectly still. The confidence that had defined his career for years disappeared in a matter of seconds. Around the ballroom, no one reached for a camera. No one whispered. The reality unfolding before them demanded complete attention. Ryan Keller spoke in the same calm voice he had maintained throughout the evening. Mr. Ellis, I advise you not to leave the room. Richard forced a weak smile. Am I under arrest? Ryan answered carefully. At this moment you are being detained, pending the execution of a federal warrant. Richard looked toward Daniel. You planned this. Daniel didn't deny it. We plan to protect the company. Michael Donovan added, "The timing was coordinated with federal authorities." Richard laughed bitterly. "And Bruce helped all of you." Daniel glanced toward Bruce. "He helped protect over 4,000 employees who depend on this company." Richard looked directly at Bruce. "You spent 18 months pretending to be invisible," Bruce answered quietly. "I never pretended. You let everyone think you were just a facilities supervisor." "I was a facilities supervisor." Richard shook his head. "No." Bruce met his eyes. "I simply had another responsibility." The simplicity of the answer left Richard without a response. Ryan's phone vibrated again. He read the incoming message before looking at Daniel. "The Chicago team has completed its assignment." Daniel nodded once. "And Columbus?" Ryan smiled slightly. "Also complete." A ripple of uncertainty spread through the ballroom. Several executives exchanged nervous looks. Rebecca Collins stepped beside Daniel. "For everyone's awareness, coordinated search warrants were executed simultaneously at multiple locations," Michael continued. "Corporate offices, private residences, 2 off-site storage facilities." The room absorbed the announcement in stunned silence. One board member quietly asked, "How many people?" Ryan answered honestly. "The investigation identified a network rather than a single individual," Daniel continued. "Fraud of this size is rarely committed alone." Rebecca opened another folder. "The scheme involved shell vendors, false maintenance contracts, duplicate invoice approvals, altered procurement records." She looked around the room. Each participant handled only a small piece. Michael finished the explanation, which allowed everyone involved to believe they could never be connected. Bruce quietly added, "Until someone started connecting the pieces." Ryan smiled. "Exactly." Richard slowly lowered himself back into his chair. His shoulders had collapsed. For the first time all evening, he looked defeated. Autumn watched Bruce with quiet amazement. "I still can't believe you carried all of this alone." Bruce gently corrected her. "I wasn't alone." He nodded toward Daniel. "Or Michael. Then Rebecca. Or Ryan." "They carried it too." Daniel overheard the exchange. "And yet," he smiled, "none of us could have done it without you." Bruce looked away awkwardly. "I've had enough attention for one night." Several people nearby laughed softly. Even after everything, Bruce remained exactly the same. That consistency impressed Daniel more than any speech could. One employee from the facilities department slowly stood. His name was Marcus Hill. He looked at Bruce. "I've worked with you for 9 years." Bruce smiled. "I know." Marcus shook his head in disbelief. "And you never told any of us," Bruce answered gently. "I couldn't." Marcus nodded. "I understand." He paused. "I just wanted to say," his voice caught slightly, "I'm proud to work with you." The statement was followed by spontaneous applause from several employees seated nearby. Bruce looked genuinely touched. "Thank you." Another facilities technician stood. "So am I." Then another. Within moments, nearly the entire facilities team had risen to their feet. Unlike the earlier standing ovation, this one felt deeply personal. These were the people who knew Bruce best, the people who had repaired boilers beside him, painted walls, replaced broken pipes, worked overnight during winter storms. To them, Bruce had never acted like a supervisor. He had always worked beside them. Daniel quietly watched the scene unfold. He leaned toward Rebecca. "Now they know." Rebecca smiled. "They always respected him." Daniel nodded. Tonight they'll understand why." Across the ballroom, Victoria remained seated. She watched members of Bruce's own department applaud him with genuine affection. Not because he had become famous, because he had always earned their respect. She suddenly remembered every family gathering where she had implied Bruce lacked ambition. every Christmas dinner where she had compared him to executives, every birthday where she had asked when he planned to find a real career. Each memory now felt painfully different. Charles quietly reached over and placed a hand on hers. She didn't speak. She couldn't. Ryan received another message. He read it carefully. Then he looked toward Daniel. The final search location has been secured. Daniel asked only one question. The evidence, Ryan smiled. Recovered. Rebecca slowly exhaled. 18 months. Michael nodded. Worth every day. Daniel turned back toward the audience. I can now confirm that the central evidence supporting this investigation has been secured by federal authorities. A collective sigh swept through the room. The uncertainty that had lingered for months inside the investigative team had finally ended. Bruce closed his eyes for a brief second. It was over. The long nights, the constant caution, the endless patience, the responsibility of protecting a secret. For the first time in a year and a half, he felt the weight begin to lift. Autumn quietly slipped her hand into his. He looked at her. She smiled. You can finally come home on time. Bruce laughed. I hope so. Daniel smiled as well. I suspect your evenings are about to become much less complicated, Bruce answered with a grin. My wife might actually expect me to help cook dinner again. The room laughed warmly. The tension that had dominated the evening eased for the first time. Ryan looked toward Bruce. Although, Bruce raised an eyebrow. You'll probably be completing paperwork for a while. Bruce sighed dramatically. I knew there had to be a catch. Even Ryan laughed. Then Daniel's expression became serious once more. There is one final matter before we conclude tonight. The room immediately fell quiet again. Daniel looked directly at Bruce. For 18 months, you've accepted every request I made. You never once asked for compensation. You never asked for recognition. You never asked for a promotion. Bruce simply nodded. That's true. Daniel smiled, which is precisely why the board and I have already made a decision. Bruce frowned slightly. What decision? Daniel glanced toward the members of the board. Every one of them nodded. Then Daniel looked back at Bruce. I think it's time we finally discussed your future with Meridian Dynamics. Bruce looked at Daniel with quiet confusion. My future? Daniel smiled. Yes. Bruce glanced toward Autumn before looking back at the CEO. I already have the future. Daniel nodded. I know. And we'd like it to remain here. The members of the board rose from their seats one by one. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. It was a unanimous one. Board Chair Eleanor Grant stepped forward. She extended her hand toward Bruce. Mr. Price. Bruce shook it politely. I've heard about you for months. He looked surprised. You have... She smiled. Long before tonight. Bruce looked toward Daniel. You told the board. Daniel shook his head. Only what they absolutely needed to know. Eleanor continued. Your name appeared in confidential briefings. Never publicly. Never beyond this room. But always with the same description. Bruce raised an eyebrow. What description? Eleanor smiled warmly. Completely trustworthy. Bruce lowered his eyes, visibly embarrassed. I don't know if I'd put it that way. Daniel laughed softly. That's exactly why we did. Gentle laughter spread across the ballroom. Eleanor turned toward the audience. Meridian Dynamics has always believed integrity is our greatest asset. She paused. Tonight we've been reminded that integrity has a face. She looked directly at Bruce. And his name is Bruce Price. Applause echoed throughout the ballroom once again. Bruce waited patiently for it to end. When it did, he quietly said, There were hundreds of honest employees who helped this company simply by doing their jobs. Eleanor nodded. That's true. But someone had to take the first step. She looked at Daniel. And someone did. Daniel walked forward carrying a slim blue folder. He stopped in front of Bruce. 18 months ago, I asked you for a favor. Bruce smiled faintly. You asked me to notice everything. I did. And you haven't stopped. Daniel handed him the folder. This time, he smiled. I'm asking you something different. Bruce opened the folder. Inside was a formal letter, printed on Meridian Dynamics letterhead. He read silently for several moments. His eyes widened slightly. He looked back up. I wasn't expecting this. Daniel folded his hands. I know. Autumn gently squeezed Bruce's arm. What is it? Bruce handed her the letter. She began reading. Halfway through the first page, she covered her mouth. Oh, her voice trembled. Bruce watched her quietly. She looked back at him. They're serious. Daniel answered for her. Very. The audience waited patiently. Eleanor finally addressed the room. The board of directors has unanimously approved the creation of a new executive position. Several executives looked surprised. This position did not previously exist. Rebecca smiled knowingly. Michael folded his arms with satisfaction. Daniel continued. The role combines operational oversight, enterprise security coordination, and organizational integrity initiatives. Bruce immediately looked confused. I don't have executive experience. Daniel answered without hesitation. You've been demonstrating executive judgment for the last 18 months. Michael added, leadership isn't measured only by title. Rebecca smiled. Sometimes the title simply catches up. Soft laughter followed. Bruce looked back down at the letter. Vice President, Operational Integrity and Enterprise Protection. He read the words twice, then a third time. Finally, he looked toward Daniel. I don't think I'm the right person. Several people smiled. That answer sounded exactly like Bruce. Daniel expected it. So tell me. Bruce nodded. What makes you think I am? Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked across the ballroom. When the investigation began, he pointed toward Bruce. You asked one question. Bruce remembered. Who gets hurt if we ignore this? Daniel nodded. You never asked who was responsible. You never asked who would receive credit. You asked who would be harmed. He paused. That's leadership, Eleanor continued. Executives can learn finance. They can learn operations. They can learn strategy. She smiled. It's much harder to teach someone to care about people before profits. Autumn continued reading the offer. The compensation package was generous, far beyond anything Bruce had ever expected. She looked up. You deserve this. Bruce quietly shook his head. I did what anyone should have done. Ryan Keller smiled. I interview a lot of witnesses, a lot of corporate employees. He paused. No, most people wouldn't. The room fell silent. Ryan continued. Most people would have ignored the inconsistencies, or convinced themselves someone else would report them. He looked directly at Bruce. You didn't. Marcus Hill, the facilities technician, spoke from the back of the ballroom. That's because Bruce never walks past a problem. Several employees nodded in agreement. Another called out, he fixes it. Bruce laughed quietly, usually with duct tape. The facilities team burst into laughter. Marcus shook his head. Not this one. No, Bruce smiled. Definitely not this one. The atmosphere had changed completely. Only 2 hours earlier, Bruce had been sitting quietly behind the executive tables. Now the room wasn't celebrating him because he had uncovered fraud. They were celebrating him because every revelation confirmed the same truth. He had always been exactly who he appeared to be: honest, dependable, unpretentious. Daniel spoke again. "The offer has no expiration date tonight." He paused. "But I sincerely hope you'll accept." Bruce closed the folder. He looked first at Autumn, then at Charles, then finally at Victoria. She still hadn't spoken. Her eyes were fixed on him, not with anger, not with judgment, only regret. Bruce returned his attention to Daniel. "I'll answer." The ballroom waited. Bruce smiled gently. "But first," he looked toward Autumn. "I'd like to make sure my wife still wants to be married to a man who's apparently much worse at keeping secrets than she thought." The room erupted into warm laughter. Autumn wiped away a tear. She stepped closer, took both of Bruce's hands, and smiled through her emotions. "I married an honest man." She paused. "And tonight I discovered he's also the bravest one I've ever known." The applause returned once more. This time Bruce didn't try to stop it. Instead, he simply looked at Autumn. Because in that moment, her opinion mattered more than every standing ovation in the room combined. Across the ballroom, Victoria quietly lowered her head. She knew that before the night ended, there was one conversation she could no longer avoid. The applause slowly faded. For the first time that evening, the ballroom felt peaceful. The tension that had dominated the celebration for hours had finally begun to dissolve. Bruce still held Autumn's hands. Neither of them seemed to notice the hundreds of people surrounding them. "I'm sorry," Autumn whispered. Bruce looked at her gently. "For what?" She struggled to find the words. "For every time I asked why you were working so late. For every moment I thought your job mattered less than mine. For every time I let my family's opinions become louder than my own." Bruce smiled softly. "You don't owe me an apology." "I do." She shook her head. "I should have defended you sooner." Bruce looked into her eyes. "You defended me more times than you remember." "Not enough." Her voice broke. "Tonight, when my mother started humiliating you," she lowered her eyes. I froze. Bruce gently lifted her chin. "I know. I should have stood beside you immediately." "You were shocked." "That's not an excuse." Bruce took a slow breath. "No, it isn't." The honesty surprised her. He wasn't dismissing what had happened. He was acknowledging it. Then he smiled again. "But one difficult moment doesn't erase 10 good years." Tears rolled down Autumn's cheeks. "You still believe in us?" Bruce chuckled quietly. "I never stopped." Without another word, she wrapped her arms around him. Bruce embraced her tightly. The ballroom erupted into spontaneous applause once again. This time it wasn't for an investigation. It wasn't for a promotion. It was for a marriage that had survived a night neither of them would ever forget. Daniel Harrington quietly stepped away from the podium. Rebecca smiled as she watched the couple. "I think they needed that." Michael nodded. So did everyone else. Charles slowly approached Bruce and Autumn. He waited until they separated before speaking. May I interrupt?" Bruce smiled. "Of course." Charles looked directly at his son-in-law. "I've been thinking." Bruce waited patiently. "When you first married Autumn," Charles sighed, "I believed you were a good man." Bruce looked surprised, but I also believed good wasn't enough. He lowered his eyes. "I confused success with character." Bruce remained silent. Charles continued. "I spent years wondering whether my daughter had settled." A painful smile crossed his face. "Tonight I realized she aimed higher than I ever understood." Autumn reached for her father's hand. "Dad?" Charles shook his head gently. No. He looked at Bruce. I should have been proud to call you my son years ago. Bruce answered quietly. You've always treated me fairly. Charles smiled sadly. Fairly isn't the same as respectfully. Bruce couldn't argue with that. Charles extended both hands. I hope you'll give me another chance. Bruce accepted them immediately. You never needed permission. Charles laughed softly. You're making this apology easier than I deserve. Bruce shrugged. Life's already too short. Daniel overheard the exchange and smiled. That, he quietly told Rebecca, is exactly why everyone trusts him. Rebecca nodded. He doesn't keep score. Across the ballroom, Victoria still hadn't moved. She remained seated alone while conversations resumed around her. Olivia approached cautiously. Mom. Victoria didn't answer. Olivia sat beside her. I've never seen you this quiet. Victoria stared at Bruce from across the room. I've spent years believing I could judge people. Olivia followed her mother's gaze. So have I. Victoria spoke almost to herself. I thought expensive suits meant responsibility. I thought executive titles meant integrity. I thought confidence meant strength. She slowly shook her head. I was wrong about every one of them. Olivia didn't disagree. For perhaps the first time in her life, she had no sarcastic comment to offer. Daniel returned to Bruce carrying the blue folder. I realize tonight has been overwhelming. Bruce smiled. That's one way to describe it. Daniel laughed. You don't have to answer the offer immediately. Bruce nodded. I appreciate that. But, Daniel raised an eyebrow. But, I already know my answer. Autumn looked at him curiously. You do? Bruce nodded. I've always enjoyed solving problems. Daniel smiled. I've noticed. Bruce continued. If accepting this role allows me to protect more people. He glanced around the ballroom. Then I'd be honored. Daniel extended his hand. Welcome to the executive team. Bruce shook it firmly. Thank you. The board members applauded. Marcus Hill called from the back of the room. So, Bruce looked over. Does this mean you're finally buying a new truck? The facilities department burst into laughter. Bruce grinned. No! Marcus laughed. I knew it. Bruce shrugged. The old one still runs? Daniel laughed. I was afraid you'd say that. Autumn leaned toward Bruce. I'm making one executive decision. Bruce looked at her. What's that? We're at least replacing the driver's seat. Bruce smiled. That seems reasonable. The light-hearted conversation spread through the ballroom. People who had arrived expecting an ordinary corporate celebration now found themselves laughing together after witnessing one of the most remarkable evenings in the company's history. Ryan Keller checked his watch. My work here is finished. Bruce walked over to him. I suppose this is goodbye. Ryan smiled. For this investigation. Bruce nodded. I never properly thanked you. Ryan shook his head. You don't need to. He paused. I've worked with informants. I've worked with confidential witnesses. I've worked with corporate sources. Then he smiled. But I've never worked with anyone quite like you. Bruce looked slightly embarrassed. I'm just stubborn. Ryan laughed. I know. He reached into his jacket and handed Bruce a small challenge coin bearing the seal of the Financial Crimes Task Force. We don't give these to many civilians. Bruce looked at it quietly. I don't know what to say. Ryan smiled. You don't have to say anything. Just keep being the man you've been for the last 18 months. Bruce closed his hand around the coin. I can do that. As Ryan left the ballroom with the other federal agents, many employees quietly applauded. The investigation was over. The danger had passed. Justice was finally underway. Only one unfinished chapter remained. Across the room, Victoria slowly rose from her chair. She took a deep breath. Then, with hesitant steps, she began walking toward Bruce. The conversations around the ballroom gradually fell silent once again. Everyone seemed to understand that the most personal moment of the evening was still about to unfold. The ballroom grew quiet once again. Victoria Whitmore walked slowly across the polished floor. For the first time anyone could remember, she seemed uncertain. There was no confidence in her posture, no carefully rehearsed smile, only hesitation. Bruce watched her approach without moving. Autumn instinctively stepped beside him. Victoria stopped a few feet away. For several seconds she couldn't speak. The silence itself said more than any words could. Finally, she took a slow breath. "Bruce," her voice was barely above a whisper, "I don't know how to begin." Bruce answered gently, "You've already begun?" She nodded, swallowing hard. "I've spent years believing I was protecting my daughter." Bruce listened without interruption. "I told myself I wanted the best for her." She looked down at her hands. "But somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing people. I only saw titles." No one spoke. Victoria continued. "I judged your truck." She managed a small, embarrassed smile. "I judged your clothes." She looked briefly toward the familiar gray suit. "I judged your job." Her eyes slowly lifted to meet Bruce's. "And worst of all, I judged your worth." The words hung heavily in the air. Bruce remained calm. Victoria shook her head. "I never once asked what kind of husband you were. I never asked how you treated Autumn. I never asked what kind of man you became when no one was watching." A tear rolled down her cheek. "I only asked what position you held." Charles quietly closed his eyes. He knew how difficult those words were for her to say. Victoria looked directly at Bruce. "And tonight," her voice trembled, "I struck the finest man in this room." No one attempted to interrupt. Even Daniel remained silent. This moment belonged entirely to the family. Victoria slowly lowered her head. "I am ashamed." The confession echoed through the ballroom. Bruce looked at her for several long seconds. Then he spoke. "I won't pretend tonight didn't hurt." Victoria nodded. "I know." The slap hurt. Bruce briefly touched his cheek. "But not as much as hearing you believe I wasn't good enough for your daughter." Victoria closed her eyes. "I know. I believed success could be measured." Bruce smiled sadly. "It can." She looked up hopefully. "But not the way either of us was taught." Victoria waited. Bruce continued. "My father used to tell me something. He said people eventually reveal what they truly value. They don't reveal it with speeches. They reveal it with ordinary days." He looked around the ballroom. "The way they treat strangers. The promises they keep. The problems they choose to solve. The people they stand beside." Victoria listened carefully. Bruce's voice never became angry, never accusatory, simply honest. "I spent years hoping one day you'd see me." She blinked. "I saw you." Bruce gently shook his head. "You saw my job. You never really saw me." A fresh wave of tears filled Victoria's eyes. "You're right." She didn't argue. She couldn't, because she knew it was true. Autumn quietly slipped her hand into Bruce's. She whispered, "I'm sorry." Bruce gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. Victoria took one small step closer. "I don't expect forgiveness tonight." Bruce answered almost immediately. "You already have it." She stared at him in disbelief. "What?" Bruce smiled gently. "I forgave you a long time ago." The entire room fell silent. Victoria looked completely stunned. Why? Bruce answered with the same quiet sincerity that had defined him all evening. Because carrying resentment would have hurt me more than it ever hurt you. Daniel slowly lowered his head. Rebecca smiled softly. Ryan Keller, who had paused near the ballroom entrance before leaving, looked back one final time. Even after everything Bruce had accomplished, this moment impressed him most. Victoria covered her mouth. I don't deserve that kind of grace. Bruce nodded. Probably not. Several guests looked surprised by his answer. Then he continued. But forgiveness isn't earned. It's given. Victoria broke down completely. For years she had expected Bruce to defend himself, to argue, to prove her wrong. She had never expected compassion. She wiped away her tears. I spent 10 years trying to convince Autumn she deserved someone better. She looked toward her daughter. I realize now. She already had. Autumn embraced her mother tightly. Both women cried openly. Bruce quietly stepped back, allowing them the moment they needed. After several seconds, Victoria turned back toward him. There is one more thing. Bruce waited. She reached into her purse and removed a folded envelope. I wrote this 3 weeks ago. Bruce looked surprised. You did? She nodded. I was going to give it to Autumn. I wanted to apologize for how I'd behaved over the years. She looked embarrassed. I just never found the courage. Bruce accepted the envelope, but didn't open it. I'll read it later. Victoria smiled weakly. That's probably best. Charles stepped beside his wife and placed an arm around her shoulders. I'm proud of you. She looked at him. For apologizing? Charles smiled. For finally seeing what was always in front of us. Daniel quietly approached the family. I hope I'm not interrupting. Bruce smiled. Not at all. Daniel looked toward Victoria. Mrs. Whitmore. She nodded politely. I owe you an apology as well. Victoria looked confused. You do? Daniel smiled. I knew who Bruce was for 18 months. I wasn't allowed to tell you. She laughed softly through her tears. I probably wouldn't have believed you anyway. Daniel chuckled. Perhaps not. He looked around the ballroom. I've led this company for many years. I've watched remarkable careers develop. But tonight wasn't about discovering Bruce. He paused. It was about allowing everyone else to discover him. Bruce rubbed the back of his neck. I preferred the version where nobody noticed me. The room erupted into warm laughter. Daniel smiled. I know you did. He placed one hand on Bruce's shoulder. But leaders don't always get to choose when they're seen. Bruce looked around the ballroom, at his co-workers, his friends, his wife, his in-laws. For the first time all evening, he felt completely at peace. The investigation had ended. The truth had been revealed. Old wounds had begun to heal. And the family that once questioned whether he belonged was finally beginning to understand that he had belonged all along. The ballroom had transformed completely. Only a few hours earlier, it had been filled with quiet judgment, whispered assumptions, and carefully maintained appearances. Now those same conversations sounded different. People spoke less about titles, more about character. Groups of employees gathered around Bruce not to congratulate him on uncovering the fraud, but simply to shake his hand. One after another, they thanked him. A young engineer stepped forward first. Mr. Price? Bruce smiled. Please. Bruce. The engineer nodded. I've only worked here for 6 months. Bruce listened. I just wanted to thank you. Bruce looked puzzled. For what? The young man smiled. My father lost his job years ago because of corruption inside another company. He paused. I know what fraud can do to ordinary families. Bruce quietly nodded. I'm sorry your family went through that. The engineer extended his hand. You made sure ours wouldn't. Bruce shook it firmly. I wasn't alone. The engineer smiled. I know. But someone had to care enough to start. As he walked away, another employee approached, then another. Soon, there was a short line of people waiting simply to introduce themselves. Daniel watched from across the room. Rebecca joined him. You were right. Daniel smiled. About what? They're not thanking him because he's becoming an executive. She looked toward Bruce. They're thanking him because they trust him. Daniel nodded. Titles create authority. He paused. Trust creates influence. Rebecca smiled. And Bruce somehow earned both. Nearby, Marcus Hill stood laughing with several members of the facilities department. When Bruce finally walked over, Marcus folded his arms dramatically. So, Bruce laughed. What now? Marcus pointed toward him. You become an executive and suddenly forget the rest of us. Bruce pretended to think about it. I was considering it. Marcus gasped theatrically. I knew it. Bruce grinned. But then I remembered none of you would let me. The entire maintenance team burst into laughter. Another technician stepped forward carrying a small cardboard box. Bruce recognized it immediately. My toolbox. The technician nodded. You left it in the maintenance office. Bruce accepted it. I probably won't need this upstairs anymore. Marcus immediately shook his head. Oh no. Bruce looked confused. What? Marcus smiled. That toolbox stays exactly where it's always been. Bruce frowned slightly. Why? Because one day some new employee is going to ask whose toolbox that was. He shrugged. And we'll tell them. Bruce laughed quietly. I don't think anyone needs stories about my wrench collection. Marcus smiled. They're not stories about tools. He looked directly at Bruce. They're stories about the man who carried them. Bruce looked down at the worn metal toolbox. The paint had chipped years earlier. The handle showed countless signs of use. It wasn't expensive, but it represented nearly 2 decades of honest work. He carefully closed the lid. Leave it there. Marcus smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. Across the ballroom, Daniel noticed the exchange. He quietly walked over. I have one condition regarding your new office. Bruce looked at him. What's that? Daniel pointed toward the toolbox. It comes with you. Bruce laughed. I don't think it matches executive furniture. Daniel smiled. I don't care. Several nearby executives smiled as well. Daniel continued. I want every vice president who walks into your office to understand exactly where you came from. Bruce answered softly. I never intended to leave. Daniel nodded. Good. Because I don't want you to. A photographer hired for the promotion celebration cautiously approached. Mr. Harrington. Daniel looked up. Yes. Would you mind one group photograph? Daniel smiled. Of course. The photographer began arranging people. Board members in the front, senior executives nearby. Autumn stood beside Bruce. Daniel motioned for Bruce to stand in the center. Bruce immediately shook his head. No. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Why not? Bruce smiled. Tonight started because of Autumn. He gently guided his wife to the center. She belongs here. Autumn looked at him. So do you. Bruce quietly answered, We both do. Daniel smiled. I think that's a fair compromise. The photographer adjusted the camera. Everyone ready? Before taking the picture, he hesitated. Actually, everyone looked toward him. I've photographed corporate events for 20 years, he smiled. I've never seen one end like this. Laughter spread through the room. The camera flashed several times. In every photograph, Bruce stood exactly where he preferred. Not in front, not behind, beside his wife. After the photographs, guests slowly began preparing to leave. Coats were collected. Conversations became smaller. The orchestra quietly packed away their instruments. Ryan Keller returned briefly before leaving the hotel. He walked directly to Bruce. "I almost forgot." Bruce looked up. "What?" Ryan handed him a business card. "My direct number." Bruce accepted it. "I hope I never need it." Ryan laughed. "So do I." He extended his hand one last time. "But if anyone ever asks whether ordinary people can make an extraordinary difference..." He smiled. I'll tell them about a facilities supervisor who refused to ignore something that didn't make sense." Bruce shook his hand. "Safe travels." "You too." Ryan left the ballroom without another word. Daniel watched the federal agent disappear through the doors. Then he turned back toward Bruce. "You know," Bruce smiled, "whenever you start a sentence like that, I get nervous." Daniel laughed. "You shouldn't." He looked around the nearly empty ballroom. "When I first met you, I thought you were simply dependable." Bruce folded his arms. "That seems accurate." Daniel shook his head. "I underestimated you." Bruce smiled knowingly. "It happened to a lot of people." Daniel nodded. "It won't happen again." He reached into his jacket pocket and removed a small company lapel pin. Unlike the standard executive pin, this one carried the Meridian Dynamics crest surrounded by a simple silver circle. "There are only 3 of these." Bruce examined it curiously. "What does it mean?" Daniel fastened it to Bruce's jacket. "It isn't awarded for rank." Bruce looked at him. "Then for what?" Daniel smiled. "For reminding an entire company that integrity is the one qualification no resume can prove." Bruce looked down at the small silver emblem. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't expensive. Yet somehow it felt heavier than any award he had ever received. He looked back up. "I'll do my best to live up to it." Daniel smiled warmly. "You already have." As the last guests drifted toward the exits, Bruce took one final look around the ballroom. Only that morning he had expected this to be nothing more than a celebration of his wife's promotion. Instead, it had become the night that changed his career, restored his family's trust, and reminded everyone present that the strongest reputations are built quietly, one honest decision at a time. Only one final chapter remained before the story of that unforgettable evening would be complete. 3 months later, life at Meridian Dynamics looked remarkably different. The fraud investigation had concluded with multiple convictions, the recovery of millions of dollars in company assets, and sweeping reforms to procurement and financial oversight. Employees no longer spoke about the scandal itself. They spoke about what had prevented it from growing even larger: integrity. On a cool Monday morning, Bruce Price walked through the front entrance of the company's headquarters, carrying the same weathered leather briefcase he had owned for years. The security officer at the front desk smiled. "Morning, Mr. Vice President." Bruce smiled back. "Morning, Tom?" Tom laughed. "You still don't like the title, do you?" Bruce shrugged. "It's a little long." Tom pointed toward the executive elevator. "Your elevator's over there." Bruce glanced at it before walking toward the regular employee elevators instead. "I know." Tom shook his head, smiling. "You'll never change." Bruce looked back with a grin. "I hope not." Inside the building, very little about Bruce had changed. His office was larger. His responsibilities were greater. But his door remained open. Every Wednesday morning, he still walked through the maintenance department before attending executive meetings. He still knew every custodian by name. He still stopped to help move equipment when someone needed another pair of hands. The only difference was that people no longer overlooked him. They greeted him with genuine respect, not because of the title on his office door, because they trusted the man behind it. Autumn settled naturally into her role as Vice President of Strategic Procurement. The experience had changed her as well. She encouraged open reporting, strengthened internal controls, and frequently reminded new managers that the best ideas often came from employees closest to the work. Whenever someone dismissed a junior employee's concern, she smiled and said the same sentence every time. Listen carefully. You never know who's noticing what everyone else missed. The phrase quietly spread throughout the company. Daniel Harrington often smiled whenever he heard it repeated. The culture inside Meridian Dynamics gradually shifted. Employees became more willing to report concerns. Managers spent more time listening than assuming. The company launched a new annual recognition award called the Integrity Leadership Award. To Bruce's disappointment, the first recipient was Bruce himself. When Daniel announced it during the annual leadership conference, Bruce quietly leaned toward him. You planned this, Daniel whispered back with a smile. You should know me by now. Bruce sighed dramatically. I was hoping to avoid another speech. Daniel chuckled. Not this time. Bruce stepped onto the stage amid warm applause. He looked across hundreds of employees. Executives, technicians, engineers, receptionists, warehouse staff, interns. Every department was represented. He smiled before speaking. I've been thinking about what to say. The audience became quiet. I finally realized the award shouldn't really belong to one person. He looked around the room. Every honest decision someone makes when nobody is watching protects everyone else. He paused. So if you ever find yourself wondering whether one small action matters. He smiled. It does. The audience rose in a standing ovation, not because the speech was dramatic, because everyone believed him. Afterward, Marcus Hill caught up with Bruce outside the auditorium. You know, Bruce smiled. What? You still owe me lunch, Bruce laughed. I do. You promised after becoming vice president. Bruce pretended to think. I don't remember making that promise. Marcus folded his arms. I do. Bruce smiled. Then lunch is on me. Some things never changed. At home, life became quieter. Bruce still drove the old Ford F-150, although Autumn eventually convinced him to replace the worn driver's seat. She considered that one of her greatest accomplishments. On weekends, they still worked in this garden together, still cooked dinner together, still laughed about the unbelievable night that had changed everything. One evening, as they sat on the front porch watching the sunset, Autumn rested her head on Bruce's shoulder. Can I ask you something? Bruce nodded. Always. That night. She looked up at him. When my mother slapped you. Bruce remained silent. Were you angry? He thought for a long moment. No? She looked surprised. Not even a little. I was hurt. He answered honestly. But anger would have made the evening about me. He smiled gently. I wanted the truth to speak for itself. Autumn reached for his hand. It did. Across town, Victoria and Charles had changed as well. Sunday family dinners slowly became something Bruce genuinely looked forward to. Victoria no longer introduced him by his job title. She simply smiled proudly and said, This is my son. The first time she said it, Bruce noticed. He also noticed she didn't add another word. She didn't need to. Their relationship wasn't repaired overnight. Trust rarely works that way. It was rebuilt one conversation at a time, one ordinary Sunday after another. One sincere apology followed by consistent actions, exactly the way Bruce believed trust should be earned. Months later, the framed photograph from Autumn's promotion celebration found a permanent place inside Meridian Dynamics headquarters. It did not show Bruce receiving an award. It did not show Daniel giving a speech. It showed Bruce and Autumn standing side by side, smiling naturally, surrounded by co-workers, friends, and family. Beneath the photograph, a simple bronze plaque carried only one sentence. Character is revealed by what we choose when no one is watching. Visitors often stopped to read it. Some asked about the story behind the picture. Longtime employees always smiled before answering. They rarely began with the fraud investigation. They rarely mentioned the promotions. Instead, they started with a quiet facilities supervisor who noticed something that didn't make sense and cared enough to do something about it. Because that was the real story. Not about a promotion, not about a title, not even about exposing corruption. It was about the extraordinary strength hidden inside ordinary integrity. And for everyone who had witnessed that unforgettable evening, one lesson remained long after the applause had faded. Never measure a person's value by the chair they occupy. Measure it by the lives they quietly protect. Every great story reminds us that life is not determined by appearances, titles, or the opinions of others. It is shaped by the choices we make when no one is watching. Bruce was underestimated because people judged his old truck, his simple clothes, and his modest job. Yet none of those things defined his character. What truly defined him was his honesty, humility, loyalty, and courage to do the right thing, even when it meant working in silence, receiving no recognition, and enduring unfair judgment. In the end, the truth did not need to shout. It simply revealed itself through consistent actions over time. Perhaps the most powerful lesson is that respect cannot be demanded and trust cannot be bought. They are earned through integrity, one decision at a time. We may not control how others see us today, but we always control who we choose to become tomorrow. Never let someone else's opinion convince you that your value depends on your salary, your title, or your social status. Your greatest wealth is your character. Because when everything else fades, character is what people will remember. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of someone in your own life, we'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What lesson did you take away from Bruce's journey? Your story may inspire someone else who needs encouragement today. And if you enjoy meaningful stories about integrity, resilience, family, and justice, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never